I feel very fortunate to have now Ambassador Taylor has been here before, and then we've had him on twice with Zoom. So kind of like Ambassador Newman, we consider him an old friend. And I got a chance to meet Dr. Hill at the National World Affairs Council last year and just had a wonderful visit, and feel like I've got to know you very well. And you are now a new friend. In other words, I'm going to bug them, call them, email them, and so on to find out the latest scoop. I think it's important to understand that in Peoria, it's not easy to get here. There's no direct flight. And they have to take extra time. And with the Brookings Institution, U.S. Institute of Peace, these are also leaders at these institutions who are very busy people. I'm especially grateful that they come in person to meet with you and speak to us out here in the heartland. And we've talked about, we think how important that is for people out of DC and stuff to come out here. And I am just tremendous gratitude for that. The reason I'm sitting in the middle, I'm your new president of the United States. I decided to do this a little differently than just a panel discussion. And I'm not Biden or Trump or any of the ones we've talked about.
But you are called
you
Donald.
Breathe. Well, I am. Well, yeah, that's why I shortened it to Don. But I was Donnie in high school. So I'm going to ask them. Ambassador Taylor is back as ambassador in Ukraine. Dr. Hill is back on the National Security Council in charge of the region. So they're in their familiar roles. I've had Ambassador Taylor fly back from Kyiv to meet with me here in the Oval Office. And so I'm going to be asking them to give us what they would do for a briefing in the Oval Office, that what I need to know with what's going on. And I'm also going to ask you for your recommendations on that. So I'm going to start, though, with Dr. Hill. I would like an update on the current battlefield situation from Russia's perspective and what you think their capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses are. And also, what do you think Putin's current hold on power is with the Wagner Group episode and so forth? And lastly, what is it I really need to understand about Putin and Russia as I make my decisions?
Well, Mr. President, thank you for, first of all, having us here to Peoria in that president role. It's really wonderful to be here. But back to the Oval Office as the president. Can everybody hear okay if I do this? Because I couldn't fit it on my head. I'm sorry about this. I just have to say, there's briefers. You often have these kinds of challenges. Sometimes things go totally wrong. So I'm obviously having, kind of some kind of malfunction here with my briefing equipment. But Mr. President, in terms of the battlefield, President Putin thinks about this in different ways. There's the actual physical battlefield, where things, certainly on the surface, and according to our intelligence and all the analysis that we have, seem to have reached something of an impasse, even from Putin's perspective. He's lost a lot of men, he's lost a lot of equipment, but he has taken the time over the last several months to really dig in. And one of the issues, and of course with our ambassador flying in from Kiev, he can tell us how it looks from the Ukrainian perspective. Putin can't really push forward at this point, but he can also really prevent the Ukrainians from making any major gains on the ground. So you'll have heard from your briefings from our colleagues over in the intelligence services. You probably had.
I've actually read them.
So you've actually read the briefings. Well, then you're already well ahead of the game here. But I'll summarize from some of the things that you probably saw there, that the Russians have laid miles and miles of mines. They've dug all kinds of trench defenses. They've made it very difficult for the Russians and the Ukrainians in their counteroffensive to push forward. So right now they're literally digging in and have dug in what they think is going to be the long haul. But they don't really have, as we'd said, really the capability at this point to push forward. So the second part of this on the battlefield, and again, we can hear more from Ambassador Taylor about how things look from the Ukraine, is Putin right now is playing for a much bigger battlefield, the political battlefield. And this is where we come in beyond our continued provision of armaments to Ukraine. What Putin is anticipating is that the battle for Ukraine will now be won here in Washington, D.C. He's looking ahead to our election in 2024. He's trying to see whether you, Mr. President, will be re-elected or whether another Donald will be elected in 2024.
Polls don't look good for me, but they do for the other.
Yeah, and exactly. And he's watching this very closely because Putin believes that the United States will fail the test of its own resilience and ability to prosecute the war, to maintain US support, public support for the war. And he also knows that US leadership is critical, that the Europeans are looking to the United States as well. So Putin right now is betting on the fact that we will blink first, that we will pull back from this conflict. So our leadership and perceptions about the United States right now are critical. So even as we think about the battlefield and whether we may be able to help the Ukrainians prevail over time, not just thinking about the next few weeks, the next months before the winter comes in, we have to be really thinking about the home front. Mr. President, you might be thinking about making a major speech to the public. Obviously, right now we have the disaster in the Middle East, the catastrophe, we've got to be thinking about our ally Israel and all of the other things that we see unfolding there. But we have to be able to demonstrate to Putin, after all of the time and the effort that we've put into supporting the Ukrainians, that we have what it takes to basically stay the course that we've already decided over the next several months and for as long as it might take in terms of seeing some breakthrough in this war.
In your expert opinion, how far can I push Putin before the nuclear option? Is he serious in your expert opinion? You know Putin as well as anybody.
You did actually ask me, Mr. President, and I forgot to respond to this bit of your question, for which I apologize, about how Putin's own grip on power looks. Mm-hmm. Well, we saw, and of course you've remarked yourself on the episode with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, just a few months ago, which of course culminated in Prigozhin's death. That showed some real cracks in the system. As you might recall, when Prigozhin was moving on Moscow, people were taking selfies with him. I remember we showed you all of those pictures and you remarked yourself about how bizarre that was. Yeah. It really showed that people were seeing Prigozhin as a kind of celebrity figure. They weren't really thinking about the implications of this for Putin and for Russia itself. We know from our opinion polling that Russian support for the war is quite passive. They don't want Russia to lose, but they really didn't want this war to be there in the first instance. And they're very worried about it over the longer term. And Prigozhin showed that all kinds of things could happen. Anything could have happened with the war with Prigozhin, with the march Prigozhin had on Moscow. He also said some truths about the war, that it was a mistake, that Putin had been deceived. And his beef was with the generals, not with Putin himself, but the generals who he said was losing the war. So this was really about how the war is being fought. And despite the fact that I've said that the Russians have dug in, people are also dissatisfied. Russia hasn't had a big victory either. This war is dragging on. And so that actually, suggests a lot of problems down the line for Putin. And we were worried, as you might recall, Mr. President, back in November of last year, that Putin might have used a nuclear weapon at that time. You might recall, and the rest of our staff here might recall, that that was when the Russian troops were pinned down on the opposite side of the Dnieper River near Kherson. And we were worried that if they got stuck there and the Ukrainians started to fire on them, which actually the Ukrainians didn't, that Putin might have been tempted in that instance to use a tactical nuclear weapon to wipe out the Ukrainian troops there. Now, it wouldn't have been very useful for his own troops either. They would have been caught in literally in the fallout. But the whole idea was then that he might use a tactical nuclear weapon to change the battlefield. But of course, our diplomacy at the time, your phone calls, your discussions with other European leaders, conversations behind the scenes with the Chinese and the Indians, who were very concerned about this as well, really, I think, quashed that at that time. So we have to keep up that diplomacy, Mr. President, in trying to do the outreach to the Chinese and to the Indians. We have to keep on pushing Putin to make it sure that it's unacceptable to use a battlefield nuclear weapon in Ukraine?
I know we put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians not to do that, didn't we, Ambassador? All right, we'll come back to a couple other things here in a moment, but yes, I want to get I know you don't normally brief the president, but I'm the president you always dreamed of. And so I want the expert opinion. That's why I flew you back here. Nobody knows the situation better than you do. And you have in reality recently been in Ukraine also. Pretty much the same questions. I'd like to know from the Ukrainian perspective and what you and the U.S. military are assessing the current battlefield situation. Where are the current capabilities, strengths, deficiencies? And also we need to get into, is Zelensky and his government going to follow through with the presidential election with a war going on? You know, I want to know what's kind of going on underneath there. I know they're preparing a little bit more with that. And again, how's Zelensky faring with the power brokers and the people behind the scenes?
So, Mr. President, you ask a bunch of questions here. So I'll try to go through those. And let me just say that I'm pleased that you brought me back from Kyiv. I'm glad to be able to have this conversation with you. I am looking at these questions that you just asked from the standpoint of the United States. What's best for the United States? How are we best going to secure our interests, our security? That's what you sent me to Kyiv for. I go there to talk to Ukrainians. They talk to me, but my first goal is making the United States more secure and more safe. So that's why you sent me out there. And in answer to your question about the situation there, it's exactly as Dr. Hill just described. That is, both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, are trying to break through lines. And both sides are fighting very hard to keep the other side from breaking through those lines. It turns out that neither side so far has been able to do that. There has been some progress, Mr. President, in the past, say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks on the ground in the southern part of Ukraine, where the Ukrainian military has reacted. Dr. Hill described their mines, their tank traps, the mining that they have done up and down that whole lot. It's about 900 kilometers, 600 miles, is remarkable. It's the trenches remind you of World War I. The artillery and some of the tanks remind you of World War II. But the ability for either side to break through has been constrained. In the past couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, the Ukrainians have dealt with these mines. Mr. President, I talked to several Ukrainian soldiers about how they deal with these Russian mines. And they were describing that in the first instance, when they tried to break through these lines with their armor, as we'd been training them to do, didn't work. And so they sent their smaller infantry units at night. This friend of mine was telling me that he would go at night on his stomach to demine a small area and then come back and then go the next night, demine a little bit further so that the armor later on can come through that corridor. And that's starting to happen in the South. It's starting to happen. So, Mr. President, you watch the reports coming out from the military and the intelligence services that will describe that. And it is possible that they could succeed, that the Ukrainians could succeed. It's hard. It's going to be very hard. It's been hard up until now. There's no guarantee. We've provided, and you've led this, Mr. President, the provision of the weapons, as well as the other support that have enabled them to get where they are right now. But it's real hard, and they're going to have to. They need us to continue, exactly as Dr. Hill said.
Let me ask you, because I've heard from a military. You're a West Point graduate. You served in Vietnam, with infantry unit in command. My military people are telling me that what happens is it funnels that equipment into a narrow corridor, and the Russians have been just bombing the daylights, and even our best equipment can't handle that kind of barrage. They weaken the Ukrainian units, making it difficult to get to the second and third line. Is my military telling me correctly or not?
Of course, your military is telling you correct.
I never trust them after Dwight Eisenhower told me not to.
No, you should trust them. You should trust them. But you should also listen carefully to the Ukrainians, because your military can't go to Ukraine. Your military can't go to the front lines and see what's actually happening.
Now, I'm not sending them.
I know.
American people crucify me.
And so that's why you have to listen to the Ukrainian, and what they will say is exactly what you said. That is, they tried it first and did not succeed in breaking through those lines with the armored equipment, the tanks and the infantry, fighting vehicles, the armored fighting vehicles. They weren't able to break through. That's why they're having to manually, with these small infantry squads, try to remove those mines. So what I'm saying is they're making some progress in the South. I will tell you that just in the last 2 days, the Russians have been making some gains, sadly, in the North. They've been reinforcing some of their units that have been battered. The Russian units have been battered, and the Russians are putting more in there around Bakhmut. They're trying to take back Bakhmut. So this is just reinforces what Dr. Hill said. It's a stalemate. Both sides trying to break through, neither side able to at this point. Let me go to your next set of questions, which was President Zelensky, amazing leader. You've talked to him a bunch of times. You visited there.
I've been surprised.
Yes, and when you were there, you were able to look. You were there walking through the streets of Kiev. The air raid sirens went off, and you didn't bat an eye. You and President Zelensky continued to walk there. You went to the wall that they have the photos of all of the soldiers that have been killed. And it was moving, and Ukrainians appreciated it. The Ukrainians loved seeing you there. That was a big morale boost for them to see the President of the United States in their capital in wartime. Again, no U.S. military there. Normally, when he goes anywhere else, our military is there. It's not the case. There's no military there to protect him. So your bravery, your courage, in going there made a big impression. President Zelensky has full support of the Ukrainian people. There is no daylight between him and the Ukrainian people, and it goes both ways. That bond goes both ways. He understands them, and they understand and support him, and it's dramatic. You can feel the support on that. It goes to whether or not, and you asked about this, whether or not they'll continue to fight, and they will. They will. And they believe, Mr. President, that if we continue to supply them with the stuff, with the ammunition, with the artillery tubes, with the long-range rockets, eventually with the aircraft and the tanks, they believe that they can win. They believe that they can. What does win mean? Win means push the Russians out of their country. They have a simple goal. That's to get the Russians out of their country.
But do I have to worry about this long range weapons I give them if they attack into Russia?
You don't. The reason you don't is that they've committed not to use any of our weapons on Russian territory. Now, they will use our weapons on Crimea, because that's Ukraine. That's Ukrainian territory. There's no doubt about that. But they have committed, and so far, Mr. President, they've held the line. They've not fired any of our weapons into Russia. They have fired some of their own into Russia, all the way to hundreds of miles into Russia. They've used their own weapons, their own drones, to bring the war. You asked Dr. Hill about the Russian people. The Russian people are now feeling a little bit uncertain about their own security, because they see that the Ukrainians can go after them just like the Russians can go after the Ukrainians.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. That if I know I'm caught in this decision, they need to take the war, it seems to me, to Russia somewhat so that the Russian people feel it. But boy, they're already, Putin's already ripping me for a proxy war.
Yeah.
And
Mr. President, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about proxy wars. The facts are on your side. The facts are that the Russians attacked the Ukrainians. They invaded Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are fighting back. That's not a proxy war. They're not fighting for us. They are fighting for themselves. The Ukrainians are actually fighting for their lives, literally the existence of their country. If they lose, Mr. President, there is no Ukraine.
And Mr. President, this is why when we're talking with our communications team, that it's very important about how we express this to the American people. I mean, most people alive today obviously don't have first-hand experience of World War II. I mean, we've seen some of the last of the World War II veterans, coming into the Oval Office, of late. But most people have some knowledge of World War II. And would we have called when we were supporting the United Kingdom and Winston Churchill before Pearl Harbor and before we entered into the war, proxy war? No, we would not. We were not fighting or providing, let's just say, material to Britain in its war with Germany, or trying to help the rest of Europeans initially to liberate themselves as a proxy war with Germany. The United States then didn't want a war with Germany. And in fact, we wouldn't have had a war with Germany had it not been for Pearl Harbor because of Japan. And you know of this, of course.
And
Japan and Germany.
I taught history
so
before
exactly,
I became
that's
president.
right.
Oh, I
Exactly
remember
right.
that. And where was that? In a college in I don't know,
Yeah,
Well,
Ronald
no,
Reagan
isn't it?
actually
Yeah.
graduated
you
from
go.
a college where I
you taught.
I taught at a
I
high school.
remember that.
Yeah.
This is what we need. We need to basically remind Americans of that history, to put it into that kind of perspective, because Ukraine is in that position that other European countries were during World War II when they were attacked by Nazi Germany.
Okay, how bold do either of you recommend I be?
Bold, very bold, very bold.
Of speech and action, sir, Mr. President.
That's not what a lot of my other advisors are telling me.
Tell them to visit Ukraine. Tell them to see what's at stake. What's at stake, Mr. President? So you to be bold, it affects us. Again, you sent me there because we care about United States security. We care about Ukraine winning this war for our sake, for our security, and the security of Europe and of NATO. So you can be bold in that support. Those people, probably they're not even in your administration. I don't think there's anybody in your administration that's telling you don't be bold.
Okay.
So be bold, Mr. President.
And it's how
My political advisors are telling me that.
Yeah, but Mr. President, it's how we explain it. I mean, we're sitting here in armchairs. You mentioned, previous presidents used to have armchair chats, fireside chats with the American people. It's a bit more difficult now with YouTube and TikTok. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, sir, I know the press secretary would kill me if I said you should go out and do a TikTok video. But I do think that you need to be out there explaining to the American people what is at stake, because Putin is basically trying to scare everybody. We've just had him over the last week. Of course, you had the briefings from our intelligence services saying that so far we can't actually prove that he's done what he said. But he said that he tested a nuclear-powered missile. We haven't been able to pick up any radiation on this just yet, the Burevestnik, the Stormy Petrel cruise missile. But he's saying that because he wants us all to think that he's been out there testing that weapon. You can see there's lots of talking about, and again, we're watching this very closely, Mr. President, whether he's going to basically pull out of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and to test a nuclear missile, or at least a nuclear weapon. It's not a missile at this point, in Novy Zemlya, the testing site up in the Arctic. And of course, it's in all the papers at the moment because everyone's talking about it. He was just recently at a meeting with Russian analysts, some of whom you might remember when they were a little more sane, and they worked with people like the ambassador and I in our other previous jobs, talking about whether Russia should change the threshold for using nuclear weapons. And he actually said no, he thought this was okay. But there's a whole debate in Russia going about whether they should scare us with use of nuclear weapons, because he is trying to fearmonger. He wants us to give up on Ukraine to avoid nuclear war. He wants us to think that this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, or this is the Euro missile scare of the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan from here in Eureka basically met with Mikhail Gorbachev to try to take the edge off the Cold War and this great nuclear risk. We need to tell the American people that Putin is trying to stop us from being bold, is trying to frighten us with the thoughts of nuclear weapons, because he's assuming that we will step back. And we made promises to assurances to Ukraine back in the 1990s. Your predecessors did. When Ukraine was pushed to give up nuclear weapons, that it inherited from the Soviet Union in 1993, we told them that if anything happened, we, the United States, along with the United Kingdom, the Russians, of course, said this too, would actually stand by and make sure that their sovereignty and territorial integrity was protected.
But am I at risk of having a Cuban Missile Crisis where we back each other into a corner where even I feel like I might have to use nuclear weapons if I think Putin? I mean, if you get backed into a corner, can I back Putin too far that he's going to respond irrationally?
Exactly, Mr. President, what Putin wants us to think. He wants to think it's a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. And you've been extremely careful so far to make sure that this is not. As Ambassador Taylor just said, we don't have, and you know we don't have American boots on the ground. This is not a proxy war with Russia. We've been very careful about this. And it's not only us who are supporting Ukraine. The Brits are doing this. Britain is also a nuclear power, though everybody seems to forget about this. The French are supporting Ukraine, also a nuclear power. China and India have been pushing Russia not to go down more of the nuclear rhetoric path than they already have. All of our European allies and NATO allies are also supporting Ukraine. And what Putin is trying to do is make it look like it's a direct nuclear standoff between us and Russia. And of course, it's not. We haven't raised our nuclear alerts. We haven't done anything on our nuclear posture. We've done nothing at all. We've just stayed exactly as we are. What Russia is threatening to do is go rogue, like Kim Jong-un has gone rogue in North Korea. And nobody else likes that. So I think there's very little risk at this particular moment of us getting into that kind of proverbial corner. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not the Cold War crises. And we have to not let Putin basically spin the propaganda that this is. You've been very good at this so far.
Which is what he's been trying to do, Mr. President. Dr. Hill is exactly right. He wants us to buy his line. But going back to your question about your political advisors, polls are hard. You know, you can get polls and polls saying,
I want to get reelected.
You want to get reelected. And what I'm going to argue is a bold policy on Ukraine will help you get reelected. It is a political winner. And here, the reason I say that is two. One is the American people, when you ask them, do you support Ukraine against the Russians? They say yes. And they say it in like 2/3, 3 to 1. When you go to the House and the Senate of the Congress, the support is also there on a bipartisan basis. There are some voices in the House that you know about who are starting to question whether or not they want to. Indeed, some are opposing.
Tucker Carlson does not agree with you at all.
Tucker Carlson is not in the House. Tucker Carlson is not.
He influences a lot of people, though. And I want to get reelected.
Who listens to Tucker Carlson? Anybody?
They aren't here.
They're not here. Thank goodness.
They're over in Eureka in Woodford County.
No, they're not. No. You don't believe that, Mr. President. You don't believe that. I know. Because they are a very small number. If you are able to get a vote in the House on support to Ukraine, military support to Ukraine, it'll pass 3 to 1. If you put that same vote in the Senate, it'll pass 4 to 1. There's strong support. You just have to get it to the right place to vote.
And it's the way that we keep talking about it, Mr. President. American people do not like bullies. America knows from its own history, and all Americans know that we fought for our freedom. This is exactly what Ukraine is doing here. And, we also know that America really benefits from our international leadership. And if we step away from this, I mean, what is left? And I don't have to say that to you, sir, but what is left of our international standing? Everybody at the moment expects that the United States is going to crumble in its resolve.
All right, I'm going to contact NATO tomorrow, and we're sending F-16s immediately.
Mr. President, you've already decided that.
You've
already decided.
Forgot.
That's right.
No, I'm not that president. I'm sorry.
The F-16s are coming. They get there late.
Okay.
Yeah. Take time.
I know I've got some later meetings today, so we'll kind of pick up here. I want to know your candid assessment of where you think we're going to be in a year from now. Or I'm sorry, not a year, to next spring. How do you think this winter is going to play out I have been told that Russia is already conducting cyber attacks on the power system in Ukraine. I'm a little bit concerned about the winter again and how things are going to go. So let me start with you,
Okay,
Ambassador.
okay.
You dare?
So no one knows, of course. That's why you're asking the question. No one knows exactly, or even generally, what's going to happen.
Best
I'll
educated
tell
guess.
you my best educated guess, and I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you two scenarios. There is a scenario where the Ukrainians do break through in the south, and if they do that, then the Russians, and Dr. Hill can talk more about the Russian fragility of their troops. They've been fighting for 19 months too, and they're tired, and they're fighting on foreign soil. The Ukrainians are fighting on their own territory. They're defending their own land. So there is the scenario that by next spring, sometime over the next several months, the Russians could be in Russian military could be in bad shape, and the Ukrainians could be able to push through on that one. That's one scenario. I'm going to get back to your question about the energy supplies, but there's another military scenario where you continue to have this stalemate. You continue to have a kind of dynamic stalemate. Neither side is able to break through. The first scenario is the Ukrainians might be able to break through. The second scenario is neither can. And if that's the case, then by this time by next spring, these F-16s that you just ordered will be there. Our tanks will also be there. What the Ukrainians have is an enormous support base. They have the United States, they have rest of Europe, they've got Japan, South Korea, Australia. They've got 20 times the economic power, 20 times the economic power of Russia and its allies. What allies does Russia have to help them economically? North Korea and Iran. That's where they are. It's 20-1 on the Ukrainian side. So the longer that goes, the stronger the Ukrainians continue to get. The new weapons get there. So I think there is a scenario, Mr. President, that has you in good shape for your reelection.
I knew there's a good reason why I appointed you.
Energy. You asked about energy. This is a problem. Not only are the Russians using cyber attacks, they are bombing electricity generating capacity and distribution capacity. That's what they did last year. We helped them. The Europeans helped them. The stocks of natural gas were very high last year. They're very high this year. But the electricity generation is vulnerable. That's why we need to send more of this air defense.
There is an element on energy that we really have to think about with our European allies. Mr. President, we just briefed you a little earlier in the week that there seems to have been some sabotage, according to our Finnish colleagues, on the energy pipeline that runs between Finland and Estonia. Luckily, the Finns, as they always are very resilient, and gas is only a small fraction of their power usage, but not so for Estonia. So I think we're going to have to be very vigilant, Mr. President, and also working very closely with our European allies on making sure that they have enough liquefied natural gas. I mean, fortunately, we are a major provider, and that we also, work to make sure that Europe keeps on building up its storage for the winter, so that we won't see the same spike in energy prices in Europe that we did last year. We were very lucky, Mr. President, as you know, that the Europeans, the Germans, were able to move very quickly away from Russian oil and gas and coal. But we do still worry that this will have implications in Europe, particularly as there are so many elections underway at the moment. We've just had the Slovak election that, of course, has reduced some of the support at that top political level in Slovakia for Ukraine. We've got the Polish elections coming up. Hungary is always on a somewhat contrary position, as we've briefed you many times. But I think, as Ambassador Taylor has been suggesting here, that there is still a lot of room for optimism, because we do still have, as we've said, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and others, the Canadians, New Zealand, Australia, a number of key countries. I think one of our biggest problems is really the perception of how well Russia is doing. And again, it's a challenge for how we counteract that. The Russian economy has been very resilient. It's adapted. We know we've cut a lot of ties with Russia, but not completely. We've been very careful about how we've handled Russian oil. Remember, we wanted initially to just completely cut off Russian oil supplies, but we realized that would make a huge spike in global energy demand and prices. It would not be popular in Peoria or anywhere else.
My relatives called me from
exactly.
Illinois telling me about gas
So gas prices,
So,
yeah. I mean, I heard somebody say, I remember when it was $1 and the gas. And I was like, when was that? Was that the time of Reagan? Because I can't remember when it was $1 for a very long time.
I was
But
a
certainly,
teenager.
exactly, it's been a long time since it was $1. But people's perceptions are that basically the price of the pump is off the charts. It's nothing in comparison to what is in Europe. But yes, people are feeling that. And inflation, we all know that has been exacerbated by the war in Russia. But we've managed that with the oil cap. And actually, we're seeing that although Russia is still earning billions of dollars in revenues, it's actually affecting the Russian economy. It's 100 rubles to the dollar at the moment, and continuing to devaluate. And as Ambassador Taylor was saying, over the longer term, things don't look that great for the Russian economy. And we've said high casualties. They've got 1 million+ people have left the country, particularly some of their best and brightest of their IT and other specialists who didn't want to be caught up in the war. And they've moved their bases of operations. They're not in Europe as much as they were before, or here in the US, they're in the Middle East. We've just had a blow up in the Middle East. It will be interesting to see, how, the Russians manage there with all of the upheaval that will be there. They're more reliant on China than they were before. And as Ambassador Taylor said, they've had to turn to Iran and North Korea for all kinds of military and other equipment. They're short of ammunition, just as, the Ukrainians have been. But they have ramped up their war economy. And the one thing is that's masking some of the economic problems is the war economy. As we think back again to World War II, we ramped up our war economy. We were able to move back again into peacetime private sector production. It will be much harder for the Russians to do that. So further down the line, Russia's going to have a lot of economic problems.
You've made me think the elections in Europe. I, as president, am very concerned with what I'm hearing about the right-wing populists gaining in many of our allies and countries, and what that means for our EU and especially our NATO members. If they switch governments, you've been with NATO in your career. So let me start with you. How firm? I mean, is this one that we're saying right now, yeah, we're all going to support, but in a year or two, I'm going to be looking stupid because I've got a bunch of right-wing fanatics in the European countries?
I don't think so.
And that doesn't
President.
leave
I
the
think-
Oval Office that I said.
Right. You're right. We've got your secret. No, there are some things. I think Dr. Hill's already described what went on in Slovakia recently, and we know the Hungarian issue. But what surprised me, again, from my perch in Kyiv, what surprises me is how firm the Europeans have been.
Yes.
That's
Good.
You couldn't have expected that at the beginning of this. And people didn't expect it, but the Europeans have stuck in there with the sanctions. We put on sanctions and they're on until we take them off. Europeans have to renew sanctions every 6 months, and they've voted to do that. Even the Hungarians have been able to keep these sanctions going. So the Europeans have been, and you're right to worry about what happens in the future, but up until now, the Europeans have been solid. They're looking to us. They're worried about us being solid, but the Europeans have been there. NATO, you're right. I did serve in NATO at the end of the Cold War, in the late 80s. And there were only 16 nations in NATO at the time. And it was really hard to make a decision because in NATO, everybody has to agree. It has to be unanimous for any decision. And that was very hard, even with 16. Now we have 31, soon to be 32 nations. And they're more united than I've ever seen, than anyone's ever seen. NATO, Putin has unified NATO like NATO has never. Putin has unified Ukraine like never before as well. So the unity is, you're exactly right to be concerned about that unity because that's key. And a lot, as Dr. Hill has described, people around the world, nations around the world, governments around the world are looking to you to show that leadership and to be bold.
Or get reelected.
And get reelected.
Let's get to an issue that I'm catching a lot of flack on. What should be my position about Ukraine coming into NATO if we get this conflict over? We don't want to do anything right now. But let me start with you, because what would Putin's reaction be? And I'll tell you what, I'm concerned about Article 5. Would that be enough to keep Putin from pulling another stunt, knowing that we'd all come in together? Or have I just opened a Pandora's box that I regret?
Look, we're already supporting Ukraine in terms of military support. In many respects, we've already shocked Putin completely, because what Putin was anticipating, first of all, when he launched the invasion on Ukraine, first of all, he didn't really think he was doing an invasion. He didn't think he was starting a major land war. He's still calling it a special military operation because he didn't think the Ukrainians would fight in the slightest. You heard, sir, of course, that they had their dress uniforms all packed in their suitcases, for 3 days later, and they had medal ceremonies planned and all kinds of clapping themselves on the back for taking over Ukraine. That didn't happen. He never thought that he would have, the second, the largest actually land war in Europe since World War II, largest refugee crisis, highest casualties since World War II of Russian service people as well, far outstripping Afghanistan or any other conflict on Russian soil. So this has all been a shock. And it's not just us, sir, who are providing weapons. All kinds of other NATO members and those, some who are not in NATO as well, are providing weapons. The Baltic states have given pretty much their entire arsenals to Ukraine. So, I mean, basically the message of this is, even outside of NATO, we're showing full support to Ukraine. And that needs to be the message that we're presenting. I think that
but should I support them becoming a member?
Yes.
Yes, you should.
Yes.
But I think that you have to articulate this in a very clear way in terms of the timing, because of course, the big summit in Washington is going to be right before your re-election, sir. You know that. That's why you've been worrying so much about all of this. And I'm sorry that I brought that up in such a. I should have been more delicate.
That wasn't what I needed to hear.
To hear that.
Here.
And there will be pushback from Tucker Carlson, no doubt, and others. Not that we can't handle it, about you're taking us into World War III. But what we're really telling Ukrainians, and Ambassador Taylor has been talking to Ukrainians about this at great length, is not that you're going to be in NATO at that summit in Washington, but that we're going to have a clear path, and that we're going to continue to support Ukraine and to be supporting its security for as long as it takes. The big mistake that we made in 2008, sir, which is not your mistake again, but one of your predecessors, was that we told the Ukrainians and the Georgians that one day, but not any time we were going to tell them when, that they would be in NATO. And that was really the worst of all worlds. In my opinion, as you might recall, sir, I was one of the briefers at that time. We suggested, my briefing team and I, that we did not put it on the agenda in 2008 because we knew that so many of the allies were opposed. That's not the case now. In fact, we, the United States, look to be the opposition. The Germans are nervous too because they're looking to us. The Germans want to know what we're going to decide. The Germans are really terrified that we're just not going to be there and we're just going to give up on them. But the French have said, the French would never in a million years have said anything like this in 2008. And pretty much all of the other NATO members have made it very clear, which again was not the case in 2008, that they would like to see Ukraine in. And Ukraine is decoupled from Georgia. It's not a package deal. So this is really about Ukraine, and Ukraine, sir, will have the largest, most battle-tested military. And we now have the Finns in NATO, something very different. The Finns can bring up 280,000 reserve troops. The Finns are extremely well prepared. We're still worrying about whether President Erdogan and Turkey will let Sweden in, but the whole situation has changed. And again, it's how we talk about it to the American people, and don't just let Tucker Carlson set the tone.
Well, I've talked to Erdogan several times. You talk about Jekyll and Hyde. I mean, that guy tells you one thing one day and then it's a 180 the next. So I'm trying to get sweetened in.
He
but
doesn't want to give up on his leverage. He's still waiting to see what he can
Yeah,
get out of
yeah.
this. So
I did a visit in October
Yeah,
to Turkey.
you did,
and
so.
he wouldn't talk to me.
Right.
NATO. All right. So I know your position. We've talked about that quite a bit, but you've also mentioned to me that maybe NATO doesn't feel Ukraine is quite ready for qualifications, or is it now it really is a necessity to get them in?
It's a necessity to get them in. Dr. Hill just said that they have the strongest, most battle-tested, hardened, capable army on the continent. And they would be an asset for NATO. And if Ukraine is in, that removes a big gray area. As long as Ukraine's security is not assured, it can only really be assured if they're in NATO. As long as they're not in NATO and their Ukraine security is not assured, the Russians and Putin in particular will be there threatening them. He'll invade again. He'll invade again. Now, you've said, and Dr. Hill said the same thing. That is, and President Zelensky has said the same thing. Everyone knows, he knows, understands that while they're fighting, while there's a hot war going on, they're not going to be a member of NATO.
Yeah.
The question is, can they get on the track and start negotiating? And that's what you can do next July at the summit.
I also think, so that you might think about maybe having the Finns, the Finnish president and some of the senior Finns go to talk to, various other leaders on this and explain why they joined NATO. In fact, I think pointing to Finland's decision would be a very good communication strategy, because Finland resisted being in NATO. So did Sweden, of course, for a very long time. They didn't feel like it was necessary for their security because, as I just said, sir, they had 280,000 reserves that they could bring up. They were the best prepared military in Europe. We didn't think about them all the time. Who thinks about Finland all the time when you're thinking about military terms? But the Finns have been thinking about their defense since 1939, when the Soviet Union tried to take them back into the Soviet Union again. And so the Finns were always ready to defend themselves. The difference was that they didn't feel they needed NATO, but as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, that changed. And the Finns have been very clear why. First of all, it's the nuclear threats. Finland doesn't have its own nuclear weapon. Finland thought that the Russians were rational, and suddenly they seemed irrational, and Putin was going rogue on nuclear weapons. And the Finns thought, well, if they're threatening to nuke Ukraine, maybe they can nuke us. They lied repeatedly, just as they lied to everyone. Putin lied to President Niinistö of Finland over and over again. They said, we are not invading Ukraine. This is an exercise. And the Finns thought, wow, well, if they then come back to our borders and they're just sitting there, are they going to invade us as well? Because all the troops from the Finnish border were pulled down to Ukraine. So the Finns thought, they're going to lie to us. We have no guarantees that we will not be invaded also. And then it was all the atrocities that have been carried out. The abrogation of all of the rules of law, and of course, all the guarantees that have been given to Ukraine's territory, just as been given to Finland, which used to be part of the Russian Empire, and to the Baltic states and to Poland and elsewhere. The Finns make a really good case, sir, for why it's important now to also bring Ukraine into NATO. Finland is basically saying that NATO is the best mechanism for European security at this juncture. We can reform NATO later, but we have to start thinking of how we then expand that security to the rest of Europe as well, to remove vulnerabilities. We left too many countries in a gray zone once we started to expand NATO. We needed to be thinking about this in a different way. And the Finns are very good at articulating this.
All right, let's finish the briefing with where you think my policy should go. And I'm also thinking about, we have discussed before about the longer a war goes on, the less support, the more likely you are to have the public turn and others turn against you. So I don't want to see something that's going to drag out even 3 or 4 years. And yet I'm worried that's where we're headed with this. So I want you, if you were me, should I put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate some type of deal, or where should I go on this to to be
You want
inflicted.
to end the war soon, Mr. President. And the way to do that is to provide the Ukrainians with the capability to push the Russians out of their country. And you've done some of that. And you've, frankly, with all due respect, been a little slow in some of these decisions that you've
I
made.
gotta say, if I was actual president, there would have been a lot more done than there
There
currently
you
has
go.
been done.
That's right. Well,
All right, I'll tell
wish
you that up front.
I wish you had been there because this president has been a little slow on providing the weapons that they need. But if they have the weapons they need in the quantities they need, then they can do what you want them to do. They can end the war. You asked the question, should you push the pressure? Should you put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate? No, no. Because if you're talking about a ceasefire or you're talking about a compromise, what does that mean? That means that the Russians stay in 20% of Ukraine. When the Russians stay in Ukraine, Ukrainians know what happens to their fellow Ukrainians. It's horrible. When the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out of Bucha and Irpin and Kharkiv, and they go in and they see what the Russians did in terms of these atrocities, these horrible actions, torture, rape, they're stealing children. The Ukrainians don't want to leave the Russians on 20% of their territory, which is 20% of their people. It's not just territory, it's people, it's Ukrainians. So pushing Zelensky to compromise and give up 20% of Ukrainian people is immoral, in my view, but it's also the wrong message. That says that Russia can invade and take what it wants.
I'm going to come back to the children here shortly. So you're telling me I need to get the equipment that they need to win and win quickly to get this thing over. You're telling me that that Putin is probably bluffing on the nuclear. Am I hearing you correctly?
I would be cautious about saying that he's bluffing, sir. I think what we have to do then is keep up the diplomacy. So it's not just on the battleground. I remember that I said at the beginning of the briefing, sir, that Putin is also trying to kind of win the political battleground as well. He's confident that outside of Europe, and even inside of Europe, if he can take advantage of some of the domestic politics in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere, when people start to worry about their heating bills or their food prices, or they're dissatisfied with their governments, if he can stir things up and put Ukraine in the mix there, that then there'll be a kind of a push to give up on Ukraine. He also feels that he's got the rest of the world out there. He keeps calling it the silent majority. This is, the Chinese, African publics, Latin and South America, that they hate us, sir. He thinks that anti-Americanism internationally plays in his favor. This is the people who think this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, because that's part of Russian propaganda. We need to step up our diplomacy, not just at the United Nations, where actually we've been doing reasonably well, but with our other allies, with other parts of the world as well. We've been effective in conjunction with the Chinese and the Indians in stopping Putin from actually moving down the path towards using a nuclear weapon. We've got to keep that up so he doesn't even start thinking about it again. We've got to hold our resolve if he does, heaven forbid, have a test of a weapon up in Novaya Zemlya there in the Arctic. We have to try to work with our allies on the South Africans, the Brazilians, the Indians and others, basically to change Putin's calculation. Because if he then sees that Ukraine has the ability to prevail on the battlefield, what he will try to do is then, play, on the softer parts of the international community. Because we've already heard at the UN, for example, one, you asked me, sir, to take the pulse of some of the other ambassadors at the UN. One told me that the ambassador, for example, of Ecuador had said, well, when we had a dispute with the Peruvians, for example, eventually we were forced to give up territory. Why should Ukraine be any different? Putin is pushing this kind of view. We have to work with the other countries so that they also say that it's wrong for Ukraine to have to give up territory, and other countries start to push Russia to change the perspective. It's going to be difficult, sir. It's not going to be easy. But if Putin thinks that we are not going to back off, that we are not just going to give up, it may be that his options are constrained.
I will let you know, I've been trying to get China and India to understand that as a child of the Cold War time period, and I know this is a shock, but I was born in 1950. So I remember the Chinese above ground testing where we could not make snow ice cream anymore because we were worried about the radiation levels coming over. I'm trying to get the Chinese in particular to understand that if there is nuclear weapons used, that is coming over your country and you'll be killing your own people.
Mr. President, they've
History.
got that message. You've been successful. As I think Dr. Hill said earlier, the Chinese, President Xi has told President Putin, do not even talk about using. He said, shut up. Stop talking about these things. You're not going to use them. So don't even talk about this thing. It's irresponsible. And to be fair, Putin has dialed down that rhetoric.
He's letting everybody else talk about it.
He's letting others talk.
That's right.
Now you make me feel bad because I just threw a dart at Xi's head today because I was mad at him about something he did.
Well, unfortunately for now, though, so President Xi is still supporting Russia, just enough so that they don't lose. And we have to basically try to persuade, which means that we have to do something about our own relationship with China, which I know is
We're going to have a briefing on that coming up.
Yes, exactly, coming up. And they wouldn't like it if we started to talk about it now. But we have to, really start to think about how we change China's calculations so that they can see peace on Ukraine's terms as in their interest as well. So we've got to work on that. It's not impossible because President Zelensky is also reaching out to the Chinese. We have to make Ukraine look like an asset to the rest of the world, not a liability as well.
Okay, I'm very concerned about the war crimes that have been committed. In fact, I've been asked by an outstanding group called OLLI at Bradley Osher Life Learning to do a class on war crimes next spring. And I want to be able to tell them what my policy is going to be, what we're doing with Russia. I'm concerned in particularly about the children that have been kidnapped. And whether you hit on the head, that in my administration is a hot button topic.
As it should be, as it should be. And it turns out that the International Criminal Court agrees. The International Criminal Court has identified President Putin as a war criminal for exactly that reason, for his treatment of Ukrainian children, kidnapping them, taking them back into Russia, putting them in Russian families, just eliminating their identity. So the International Criminal Court has indicted him. He's now an indicted war criminal. He can't go to any
snuck
nation.
out. I heard that my advisor telling me he snuck out somewhere today.
He could go to places that haven't.
Get him.
That's correct. He could go to places that have not signed on to the International Criminal Court.
I don't want to be
treaty.
rude, but ironically, he could come here because we haven't signed the
Let him
ICC.
come.
Though,
Let him come. Yeah.
Yeah,
I hope he would come.
that's a whole nother program sticking us
That's
up
right, that's
signing
right,
that thing.
yeah.
Do you think that even if I'm not president, do we really have any chance of helping Ukraine get those kids back?
This is a really difficult issue, as Ambassador Taylor said. I mean, of course, we have to keep this on, uppermost. It's the Russians themselves have actually bragged that it's been hundreds of thousands of children, not just the tens of thousands that the ICC and others have actually documented. And they are actually in the process of having children adopted by others and basically indoctrinated in many respects. There's no other way of describing it.
Some of the
Some of the parents and grandparents have managed to get their children back.
have been able to go into Russia and rescue their children and get them back out. Other of the children, more in the teenage, have been able to call their parents in Ukraine from Russia and tell them where they are. And some have started to come back. So it's not totally hopeless, but it's grim.
Parent and a grandparent. This one really breaks my heart. So it's at the top of my agenda. Let's finish with reconstruction efforts. And well, actually, okay, there's one thing I'm going to run out of time because we want the audience to have a chance for questions here.
You
I-
mean the rest of the staff? You
yes,
let them in?
yes,
Yes, there's people waiting.
Well, we're going to, since
we
this is
mustn't
since
lose
this was
character
a
here.
top secret briefing,
Yeah.
we have to leave the Oval Office
That's
before
right,
they
right,
can
yeah,
come
yeah,
in.
The press briefing,
I did
exactly.
have a question. You might want to bring it up. Even though this appears to be, in many cases, a World War I trench type warfare, it is also the most high-tech war.
That's right.
And even though I'm 73, I don't do TikTok because I don't like to talk Chinese. But as president, I'm doing a TikTok so I can talk since she won't talk to me directly. But it's amazing the videos you go on and watch the battle.
Yeah.
And I come across the uncensored versions.
We're getting some of our best intelligence from that. Of course,
Yeah.
everybody else is getting the same intelligence. So, yeah, it's not.
And when you
necessarily
see
secret.
the Ukrainian soldiers so often interviewed in pictures, they're all on their phone. And I know they've had to be rigged so you don't get, the GPS coordinates and then bomb you. There's a lot, but the high tech and the changing with the drones, 3D printing that they're doing for these drones. I mean, this is a war that's changing how we're thinking about the next one might be fought. So,
So, Mr.
if you
President,
want to quickly give us some.
just very quickly. So last Friday, I had an hour-long conversation with the Ukrainian senior, the top general, General Zaluzhny. He made exactly that point. He said, in fact, he drew the analogy to gunpowder. That the discovery of gunpowder changed the way wars were fought. He said technology is doing that now.
Right.
Technology is the new gunpowder, and Ukrainians, the Russians are pretty good. Let's give them credit. Ukrainians are very good, and they've got the ability to win this war on the technology side.
There's a number of things that the Russians didn't think about. Was many things when they invaded Ukraine. First of all, most of the people that we tend to think of as Russian in Silicon Valley, sir, are actually Ukrainian. Just because they spoke Russian didn't mean they were all Russians. So some of the Silicon Valley gurus were actually Ukrainian, and they've been all pressed into helping Ukrainians in this fight. There's also been a burgeoning high tech and IT sector in Russia before the war. So they've also been pressed into this. And this is exactly right. I mean, in terms of, if we think back to World War II, people had to wait for film reels to come round, and they'd go to the cinema, to watch the latest dispatches from the war. And in World War I, it was all just what was in the papers. Now we could just pick up, of course, I left my phone outside the Oval Office, but if I had my phone, we could probably, get right to
I don't have mine either.
battlefield. No, it's just as well you didn't say. It's very good. But this is because God knows what
My
might
chief
happen.
of staff has it.
That's right. But I mean, this is the remarkable. It's a whole century of warfare, from the trenches of World War I 100 years ago to now the drones and the other aspects of the battlefield. And you asked, and I think you were about to ask about reconstruction, because Ukraine actually, when I said before, Mr. President, we should make Ukraine an asset liability. Ukraine also, like, your home state here of Illinois, is an agricultural powerhouse. Now, the Russians have tried to destroy all of that. But if we started to think about, restoring Ukraine's ports on the Illinois River, all the ports and the grain transportation, restoring Odessa, but the Danube ports, for example, all the granaries, demining the fields, but also thinking about their universities. Ukraine in the Soviet period and more recently has trained a lot of people from around the world. We could work with Ukrainians to get themselves back on track again, on engineering, high tech, IT, on agribusiness, on agriculture. We don't compete with them in the markets that they sell to. And we can start thinking about that over reconstruction. We don't necessarily have to pay for this like a Marshall Plan for as we did after World War II, but we can get our business sector heavily involved as well. Places like Caterpillar, John Deere, Monsanto, Archer Daniels Midland, they were already investing in Ukraine before the war.
I've been visiting with Archer Daniels Midland.
Yeah.
Europe has made a commitment. However, the Russians should pay.
Yes.
And it turns out we can make the Russians pay. It turns out that the Russian central bank stupidly had $300 billion of their foreign currency in foreign banks, in G7 banks. There's $300 billion that's frozen by those G7 governments. And if we mount the political will to seize those 300 billion, the estimates are to reconstruct Ukraine, 500 billion. 300 billion goes a long way. And that's the Russians paying for that reconstruction.
Maybe my predecessor thought Mexico had funds and was going to pay for the wall. I will tell you quickly that Ambassador Roman Papadou, who is a former chairman of our World Affairs Council of America, and he and I have become very good friends. And so he asked me to contact, I went to the Foreign Progress Show in August, and to contact any companies that might want to be involved in helping with reconstruction and so on. I was amazed at how many of our companies here in Illinois already have a footprint in Ukraine. And one of the drone sprayers, I still have a family farm, so I'm still interested in farming. He was flying his drones, and I was talking to him, and he said, well, I buy all my drones from Ukraine. I've got 17 of them from there. There is a footprint already out there, and our precision planting over at Morton was telling me they have a business there in Ukraine, but all their employees got drafted. So they're going to have to there's some rebuilding with and Archer Daniels Midland has a major footprint in Odessa and so on. So Illinois already has a lot of connections, but I found a couple more companies that this is important. It's a chance. If you know a business, this is a chance to get, somebody who's got connections that can help you get in on the ground floor and know it's an honest business. They're taking advantage.
And this is actually one area that China was heavily investing in Ukraine before the war. In fact, I mean, one of the reasons that the Russians have probably been destroying a lot of the Ukrainian infrastructure is that China had actually just signed another big deal with the Ukrainians before the invasion to invest in agricultural production. And if you actually, the United Nations, we're a bit out of character now. So, but anyway.
Well, yeah, we're out of the Oval Office, and you're actually meeting with the press here now.
The UN has, for the Black Sea grain deal, just particularly for students, it's kind of fascinating looking at this. They have a whole chart. It's an interactive site where you can see where all the grain that's coming out of Ukraine is going to, and most of it's going to China. So, the Chinese shipping of grain from Ukraine has increased dramatically. So China's got a vested interest over the longer term, because China actually has got some problems with growing sufficient food. A lot of aridity, doesn't have the same, fertile soils. China is buying all our soybeans, here in the US, for example. Yeah, so, Ukraine could really, if we can mitigate and, remediate the, obviously the pollution of the soil and all of the damage done, Ukraine could be back on track.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. I didn't remove a lot of the tariffs that my predecessor put on stuff.
Well, anyway,
we do have two microphones here. And if you would just introduce yourself and then ask the question. They have an early flight tomorrow. So.
Yeah, whatever. Thank you.
We'll start with a PAWAC board member. They get preference.
Okay. Trevor Negus, board secretary for the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. So we've talked about this war has unified and strengthened supranational organizations such as NATO and the G8 and the EU. But we've also touched on war crimes and human rights. Does this war challenge maybe the skeptics in the Western world towards holding large nations like Russia accountable? Because will we be able to hold them accountable and find some viability that will be able to bring those people to justice ultimately?
And if I can ask for as brief an answer so we can get as many people into it.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. And, part of the problem is that we, the United States, as mentioned in passing, as we haven't signed on to the International Criminal Court, these statutes, because we're always worried that this will be applied to us, particularly we worried during Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. Look, we're going to have to, there's going to have to be a lot of soul searching done here. because we are going to have to address this whole issue of war crimes. And, you know, if we have got to have any hope of pushing back on this. There was just a vote at the UN for the Human Rights Council. The Russians actually wanted to be back on it again. And they didn't win one of the 2 seats, but they did get 83 votes, which actually shows that, you know, a lot of countries, the secret ballot as well. So people didn't actually have to vote for them. But that suggests a lot of people are pretty skeptical, like you're saying, about the value of these international institutions. People want them to work, but they're also very skeptical whether they will. So this is actually an opportunity for us in the war in Ukraine to do some soul searching and to be, you know, really, you know, honest with ourselves about living up to our values too.
Any quick response? All right, over here.
Greetings, welcome to Peoria.
This is really a person from the press.
Oh, excellent.
Former.
Formerly. But before I ask my question, I want to thank you for your testimony to Congress, for putting America first and for making Americans proud for putting the country first. So thank you for that. My questions, make them brief. What is the likely, not wishful, but likely end game? How long will it take? Does Putin need to get something in return to save face? And lastly, if our esteemed President Sanford is not reelected and the other side does, then what? Thank you for being here.
We're screwed.
Endgame. When the president asked me that question, I gave him 2 answers. That is, it's possible that the end game could be the Ukrainians actually pushing the Russians out. That is possible. It's not fantasy. It can happen. The Ukrainian military thinks they can do that. They think they can do that if they get what they need from us and from the rest of NATO, and that is coming. So that's that. Or the other scenario that I described is a longer stalemate, and then you get scenarios like East Germany, West Germany after World War II, where the Soviet Union dominated East Germany, but West Germany joined NATO, developed its economy, helped to form the EU, eventually what turned into the EU. So there's that end game as well. That's a longer game. You asked if we have to worry about Putin's face. No, this is his problem. This is his problem. Now, Dr. Hill will have thoughts about this. She knows President Putin much better than I, but I'm not worried about President Putin's face. He invaded his neighbor, a sovereign country, and he needs to figure out how to get out. He can save face by leaving the country. What happens if somebody else gets elected next year? If Russia takes over Ukraine, then we are much less secure. We are much less secure because that threat to our allies that we are committed, and I'm convinced we will meet those commitments, we're committed to defend, they are in danger if Russia takes over Ukraine. And that could happen.
Look, Putin would love to have the United States raised as any kind of major power. So Putin is actually very much hoping that the other Donald scenario happens in 2024 because he knows that the United States will be finished as the global leader, because we'll be electing someone, well, I don't want to go on and on about all of the reasons that we should not be electing, you know, Donald Trump. And the rest of the world is just watching in shock and horror or glee, you know, depending on their different perspective about this. I mean, nobody will be looking to the United States for leadership, and Putin won't have to save face or anything because our face will be, you know, in the mud, and he'll get exactly what he wants because there will be no then incentive on any part to really try to find any reasonable resolution for this. And then, you know, good luck getting good price for your soybeans or for anything else, you know, globally. There'll be no interest in anybody in really paying attention to the United States because we will have, you know, basically shown that we're no better than any other country in our democratic position. And I say this not in a partisan way, but just talking about the person of Trump himself. There is just universal horror outside of the United States and Europe that we could be actually even talking about this.
Does that put pressure on somebody like me as president that if it's not looking good for me in November, do I need to move as quickly as I can before the next?
Well, Europeans need to move as quickly as they can. And believe me, they're thinking about it because they're watching a train wreck happen. But right now they're paralyzed by watching this and don't really quite know what to do. But of course, Putin's thrilled. And actually, I think the Saudis and lots of others are thrilled. See, why is the US any better than they was? We'll be listening to them again, kind of in the future. You're already seeing that. I mean, I would actually say that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now in the Middle East and elsewhere is because this sort of perception that the United States is crumbling and is not even there. And that's kind of what Putin would need to say first. Just look at the America. That's what he's been saying, right from the very beginning. Is, why is America exceptional? Why is America any better, than anywhere else? If America shows leadership, we show that we've commitment, we show that we're still the America that everybody else, thought that we were. And, the Europeans, stick to it as well. Putin could actually just basically say, well, look, I got rid of the Nazis in Ukraine. I got what I wanted. It's going to be very difficult to, kind of push him out of, some of the places. He could very easily then just say, okay, that's great. Let's move on from here, which would actually kind of, shift to the kind of end game that that Bill's saying. Look, I mean, I don't want to be harsh about this, but I've spent 5 months in Germany and talking to everyone in Europe. People cannot believe, they think we've gone completely and utterly nuts. They can't believe that this is America. They really can't.
And this lady had dinner with Putin. So over here.
Good evening. Conrad Stinnett here. I'm the current president of PAWAC. I have lots of my predecessors in the audience tonight. You were interviewed by one of them. Thanks for coming. And the question I have for you is, how badly do you think Zelensky was underestimated both by Putin and by the Western nations?
Yeah, big time.
Big time. So President Zelensky, just before the war, just before the full-fledged invasion in February, was polling about 20 to 30%. He was way down in the polls. After the invasion, as I mentioned earlier, the Ukrainian people united around him. He stepped up. His famous line in the first week, when the Russians were just outside of Kyiv, the Russians were just on the outskirts, and there were assassination squads inside Kyiv looking for him. And we offered him a way out. We offered him to take him to safety in the Carpathians or somewhere else. And he famously said, I need ammunition, not a ride. And that endeared him, that courage, that determination to stay in Kyiv in the face of the Russian tanks, 10 kilometers out. That endeared him and gave him the stature and the support of the Ukrainians and the support of the United States, of the rest of the world. So yes, there a lot of people underestimated him, and Putin's paying the price for that.
Over here. Thank you for being here.
So I'm Chase Weed. I'm a student at East Peoria Community High School. And so you talked about the Russian economy and how the sanctions have been affecting it. And so what I want to know is that Russia has a lot of experience having an isolationist government going back to the Cold War, and also they have North Korea on their side, who also has a lot of experience running these isolationist governments. And so can we see a scenario where these sanctions just keep lasting and where Russia runs their economy on what they have for 20, 30 years, just running this isolationist policy that they worked on and that eventually collapsed during the Soviet era?
I think it's a really great question, Chase. And in fact, some representatives from other countries might say, well, look, the Russian economy it'll just totally adapt, it'll reorient, it'll trade with the BRICS countries, Brazil and South Africa and, other countries, but it'll be And I think that's actually true. That, I mean, we're already seeing that, but it'll be a very different economy from what it was before. I mean, Russia, back in the 2010s was on track to be, there was a reference before there to the G8. Russia was in the top 8 countries economically in the world. But I mean, that's not going to be where it will be, down the line, because it won't be able to keep up with all the innovation, the kind of high tech developments. It'll be, much more the kind of economy that you're talking about before. And the Soviet Union, the Russian economy didn't actually have to, or the Soviet economy didn't actually have to collapse. I mean, what happened was they overspent. They didn't marshal, the revenues from oil and gas. But what's, happening now is we're seeing Europe, which was the biggest purchaser of Russian gas, moving away, completely. And the Chinese and the Indians are getting the oil at a discount. And they're not really kind of getting, large amounts of, Russian gas at this point. So, we can see a different Russian economy. You're not wrong at all. I think we could actually see the Russians continuing for a very long time, but it's not going to be the kind of economy that it had previously, but it's definitely adapted. It probably won't collapse in the same way, but Russia won't be one of the great economic powers that it potentially could have been if Putin hadn't, gone on this course.
Let me see if we can get those that are standing, if we can get you all in and try to maybe do this in 10 minutes. So I can get them to bed. They have to be up about 4:30 or so, I think, tomorrow morning. So
I wish you hadn't said
all right,
that.
I think we're back over here.
Yeah.
I'm Barb Drake. I'm a retired newspaper editor and retired PAWAC board member. There is a lot of talk in Congress, a lot of effort to end aid to Ukraine. What are the odds, do you think, of that happening? And what happens if our aid to Ukraine is ended?
Bill, you want to take that one?
Sure. There's a lot of talk, exactly what you say, but it's from a very small part of the spectrum, in particular in the House of Representatives. The Senate is solid. The Senate's going to pass probably even increase what the president asked for. The House will be a challenge. If it's just a vote, on support to Ukraine in the House of Representatives, it'll pass. The question is getting it to that vote. So I think that I think the odds of it being reduced, as you asked, are low. I think they will be able to come up with a way to get that vote in the House and pass in the Senate, and that will move it forward. If it happens, but you asked the next question: what if they can't get it through? What if I'm wrong and they can't get it through? If then, as President Zelensky said to the Senate when he was here, he says, if your assistance doesn't come, we'll lose.
What's that?
He said, we will lose. If he doesn't have the support from the United States that is now going through the Congress. That's the flip side of what I said. That is, he can win if he does get that kind of support. And Mr. President, you asked about the politics of this. If the Ukrainians start doing well, if you provide them with what they need so that they can start to win, that support comes up. The support of the United States Congress, support and the American people comes up. When they see a winner, when they see it moving,
They see quick progress.
they see progress. Exactly right. That support will be back. So that's what I would say, Barb. Thank you.
Want to add or? All right, we'll keep moving.
Hi, I am Colin Hieronymus, and I'm also a student at East Peoria Community High School. And I just wanted to ask about the current demographics of Ukraine. As you can see, millions and millions of people have fled the country as refugees, and of course, the children being kidnapped and the young men dying in war. So, do you see a sort of demographic crisis in Ukraine's future, or do you think that are refugees going to come back? How are they going to recover from that?
I'll just pick up on that, but I mean, as Bill has been, Ambassador Taylor has been saying right from the very beginning, the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival here, and so we have to put that into this context when I say what I'm going to say about the demographics. Wars devastate countries. particularly a country where the war is being fought. And every country we look at, through history that's had a major war of this nature has been affected demographically. World War One, World War Two, all the European countries. And we had a population of about 40 million in Ukraine. And we've got about 6 or 7 million refugees now in Europe. The numbers have dropped a bit because some people have actually gone back. At one point, it was about 8 million. We've got about the same number internally displaced. Most of the refugees are women and children. There are about 1.5 million or so in Germany, and some European countries would like them to stay. So that's a problem. Because, this is very different. If you think in Germany, all the backlash came because it was mostly single men from Syria and Afghanistan and others coming. That wasn't particularly popular. Loads of, no offense guys, but loads of, single guys appearing in countries usually seems like an invasion, rather than anything else. But women and children coming, there's been a very different approach to the refugees there. And I actually spoke to a German official who said, we hope they'll stay, which again will be very problematic for Ukraine for demographics. So if you play this out, you might see, a Ukraine whose population drops precipitously, for over the next generation to more like 30 million or even 25 million. That's a very different country from a country of 40 million. But I also should have said earlier to Chase's question about Russia. Russia's demography is going to be hit by this as well, because the 1.5 plus, million Russians who've left are mostly men, but they've gone off to other countries. They might not come back again either. And we talk about the Ukrainian casualties, although we don't really sure about the numbers, but we've heard, figures about 75,000 amputees, because a lot of them are in Europe, by the way. I mean, there was a small number have been brought to the United States, but the bulk of the Russian casualties, the Ukrainian casualties being taken care of in places like Germany and elsewhere. We're just not hearing about that, but the Russians are not taking care of their casualties. We actually think that the Russian, death and casualty rates are far higher. And that's going to have a demographic effect on Russia as well, because we're already seeing, the calling up of hundreds of thousands of people. They've been taking people out of jails. They've been expanding the conscription, from sort of 18 up into the 30s into the 40s. That's going to have an impact too. So it's not just going to be Ukraine that's demographically impacted by this.
One thing that I didn't bring up tonight and made me think, because I'm leading a trip to Cuba in December, is the Cuban government is very upset because Russia is paying, the economy is horrible in Cuba, and they are paying Cubans basically be mercenary soldiers on the front line. And I've been reading a lot of articles.
They're doing this in Central Asia as well, and people with
very
dual citizenship. And
if they get $2,000 and $50 a month for many of the people is their wage.
Yeah.
And so 2,000, if I die, my family is rich.
Yeah.
And they're dying on a pretty good basis. So that's another whole controversial issue. All right, we're over here, and then we've got two over here.
I'm Rich McBride, another former board member. So far, all the discussion I've heard about Putin and whether he will use nukes seems to assume that he's not a sociopath, seems to assume that he's logical by our definition. I'm sure everybody in here has met someone who, when confronted with the possibility of losing, will say, if I can't have it, I'll ruin it for everyone.
Yeah, that's what he's already doing. Yeah.
What would it take? Would it take his own personal health crisis, doing poorly in the elections, or losing power anyway internally? Facts on the ground. What would it take for him to push the button?
He's already ruining Ukraine. I mean, he's pretty much, blasting the place to oblivion at all times. The time when we thought that he might use a battlefield nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon, I mean, people say, what does that mean? It means a sort of smaller yield nuclear weapon. It's still going to be a nuclear weapon. Was when a large contingent of the Russian army were pinned down on the the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper. It's still the Ukrainian side on the other side of the Dnieper, but let's just say that was being encroached on by Ukrainian forces trying to push them out of Kherson. And we were very worried about that at that moment, that he just wanted to kill a very large number of Ukrainian soldiers. He'd also have killed a lot of Russian soldiers as well. And that's when we had the Indians and the Chinese and others basically say, don't do that. Because he's not going to be doing this in a vacuum, right? There are other countries that this is no longer just the Soviet Union and the United States and maybe the Chinese, the French and the Brits having a few nuclear weapons. This is a world in which India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. It's a world in which Kim Jong-un is blasting off weapons left, right, and center. It's a world in which the Iranians are trying to get a weapon. So a world in which the Saudis and the Turks would like to have a weapon. So we've got the Israelis and the South Africans and all kind of others, in the mix here. So if Putin does something like that, it has consequences beyond that battlefield. Now, that's not to say, saying I never rule out, this, but it's got to be, he has to have the kind of effect that he wants. I don't think, based on Putin, watching him during COVID or at any other time, that Putin has a death wish. I'm not saying he's rational in our sense, but he's rational in his own sense. If it was somebody who wanted to take everybody down with him, he's taking some pretty extreme COVID prevention techniques, sitting over here and, everybody else at the side of a table. He spent most of his time in a bunker. He's got all these body doubles, so people say, running around all over the place. I don't think that this is a man who wants to take everybody down. The button, so to speak, the suitcase that he carries around is for the strategic nuclear weapons against us. I mean, that'd be instantaneous, kind of annihilation. So he's been talking about nuking the Ukrainians. And again, the Chinese don't want him to do that. The Indians don't want him to do that. That reduces the threshold of others using a battlefield nuclear weapon. So it's complicated, but we've got to keep, kind of talking about this. It's also not clear that other Russians would follow that chain of command. You can't just literally push a button for a battlefield nuke. We haven't seen any sign that these are being moved around. And if you remember, during the Cold War, there was Stanislav Popov, the equivalent of the Minuteman, who didn't actually, we've had an anniversary of this recently. Who there was a false alarm of basically missile hit on the Soviet Union. He didn't press the button. So there are other people, basically involved in this. People can go back and read about that episode. Right. It's not a given that Putin would get what he actually wants on this. And obviously there is some risk from people internally in his system. Beyond some of the academics are out there talking about nuclear weapons all the time, because that's kind of their job to do it, to scare everybody. There's an awful lot of people who are really trying to act behind the scenes to try to stop all this loose talk about nuclear weapons as well. It's not to say his entire system would like to kind of go down in a blaze of flaming glory with him.
Okay. Our last two over here, Cope.
Yeah, my name is Coke Mattingly. I'm a former chief advisor to the president. He didn't
I
like
thought you
the way,
still are.
He didn't like the way I want to solve problems. But what I'm wondering, what role AI is going to be playing in our defense systems, intelligence systems, weapons development, and if we don't stay on top of it more than our adversaries, what's going to happen?
All right, Bill.
As short as possible. That's another program. Cope.
Yeah, exactly. General Zaluzhny said that the side who develops the technology, including AI, first will win. He's absolutely convinced, and he's convinced that the Ukrainians will do that because they have the mindset, they have the innovation to do that. But the answer to your question is, if we don't invest in, if the Ukrainians don't, and if the Russians or the Chinese do, then that puts us at a real disadvantage. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Cope.
All right, and our last one.
I'm Sam Hahn, and I'm a student here at Bradley. I was under the impression that one of the reasons Russia gives for its invasion of Ukraine is Ukrainian NATO membership. If we allow further them to progress down that road, are we ushering in their total destruction?
So I would say that we and the Ukrainians decide if they come into NATO. Putin doesn't get a vote in that. He can bluff, he can bluster, he can say that he doesn't like this. You know, I don't think it's NATO per se that he's got a problem with. He barely flinched, barely blinked when Sweden and Finland said, we're going to join NATO. He didn't like it much. It didn't bother him, didn't seem to bother him. It's not NATO. It's the loss of Ukraine as part of his. He wants to dominate Ukraine. NATO is just one way that Ukrainians want to get out of his clutches, and that's the concern. But no, I think that's a decision for the Ukrainians and for the rest of NATO to make about whether or not they come in.
Thank you.
Last word.
I'd like to say something on the NATO issue because you know it's actually a much more complicated discussion than it always seems. I mean, we have a lot of people saying in very black and white terms, you know, as you're pointing out here, that you know this is all provoked because of Ukraine wanting to join NATO. But if we go back to the early 1990s, when Ukraine was being pushed by the United States to give up the nuclear arsenal it inherited from the Soviet Union, there was no talk whatsoever about any kind of Ukrainian or any other country entry into NATO at that point. And there was already a lot of pressure being put on Ukraine by Russia. It's one of the reasons why we signed this Budapest memorandum with the UK and in Russia to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. I think that the point is that when the Soviet Union was pulled apart, there was the creation of this Commonwealth of Independent States, which all of us have forgotten about now. It seems so ridiculous now to think that was even there. It wasn't like the British Commonwealth, you know, with all these sporting events and everything. It was meant to be actually keeping the Ukraine and Belarus and all these other countries still close to Russia. Most people in Moscow just couldn't imagine Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, everywhere else going off in other directions. And so as Bill's basically saying, NATO, the European Union, any other kind of alliance in which Ukraine or any other countries joined would have seemed like an affront, because it's the whole idea that they would go off somewhere else. And so, you know, NATO has been an issue because Putin thinks of it as an insult. But, you know, the fact that the Swedes and the Finns have joined shows that he doesn't really think that NATO is that much of a threat. It's really about what Ukraine is deciding to do. And at this point, he's already invaded. He's already trashed the place. He's already killed, you know, tens of thousands of people. So he's changed the calculus.
Does it have anything to do with the proximity of Ukraine to Russia, as opposed to Sweden and I think you said Finland?
Well, Finland's right there. Finland's got a huge long border with Russia. So I mean, we've just added hundreds and thousands of extra miles of NATO territory. I think we also think about the expansion of NATO in the wrong way, to be honest. I mean, and I used to think about this too. And Bill's been at NATO. You kind of think that there's a whole bunch of guys sitting around in NATO, like Bill, deciding where NATO is going to go next. But it's countries that decide to join. So in the early 1990s, most people said that they didn't actually want to see NATO expand from NATO's perspective. But then Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, after splitting up from Slovakia, formerly Czechoslovakia, wanted to join. Now, those were all three countries that had actually been invaded by the members of their own former Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact was set up to counter NATO, but it actually spent all the time invading its own member states. So the Hungarians were invaded by the Red Army in 1956. The Czechoslovaks were invaded in 1968, and the Poles were constantly put under pressure. And then, kind of basically had their own, coup and military takeover under General Jaruzelski in the 1980s. So, the first countries that want to join NATO are the countries that are like, well, we don't want to be invaded again by the previous military alliance we were part of. And then you get the Baltic states that had been invaded by the Soviet Union and incorporated into the Soviet Union during World War II. And it goes on and on and on. And those countries I used to think that NATO shouldn't expand, but, then I get, yelled at by Poles and Hungarians and Czechs and others saying, why can't we join? And when the Finns decide to join, that things have really changed, because the Finns for years would say, no, we don't need NATO. We'd like the door to be open, but we don't want to join. And when the Finns decide to join, the Swedes are like, oh, heck, the Finns are joining. We'd better join as well. That means things have got really bad. So it's just that everybody's clamoring to join. It's not that people are sitting in NATO, thinking that we're going to expand out. And that's where we get into these problems all the time, because Russians still think in spheres of influence. We've been trying not to think like that for a very long time. So if you think that Russia has the right to basically dominate other countries, then that's why it always seems that NATO is a threat. And for Putin's point of view, he does think he has the right to dominate other countries. So them joining NATO makes it much difficult for him to put pressure on them militarily, economically, and politically, because it changes the calculus. And at this point, as most European countries would say, he's done so much damage to Ukraine. Why should Ukraine not be in NATO?
Before Angela closes us out, I want to sell a book.
That particular one?
There is nothing for you here, except there is in Peoria.
There is.
Excellent book. You can kind of see I've worked it over here, dog ears. There's highlights galore. An outstanding book. It is her life story, but it also includes her time on the National Security Council in the previous administration and some of the fun times that were going on there. It's illuminating kind of, I think, behind the scenes too, of how you have to work within while you're trying to get the expert opinion. The other thing is the high school students and teachers. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
These are two of the leading experts. And they're here in Peoria. I mean, this is a rare opportunity to have this kind of knowledge. And I appreciate that you guys are here. I hope you've learned something. I hope the audience has learned something. And I really appreciate you coming. And Angela?
Thank you. One more time, thank our panel here. And allow me to take just a moment to put a plug in for the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Taylor doesn't necessarily run them, but USIP, as I like to call it, USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, also puts on programs for college students and college faculty that you can join and hear experts and join a conversation in a very casual way. They're done on Zoom. So if you're interested in any of those, let me know. I'll get you on the mailing list and we'll connect you with, I think it's Allison Sturma who runs that. So it's a fabulous program. They always have really good conversations. So
and go to Brookings if you want to catch anything.
Yeah, think tanks everywhere. Seriously, they're called think tanks because they're the brightest minds in our country and from around the world who are helping us shape foreign policy. So Brookings is terrific, U.S. Institute of Peace and many others. So again, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, Peoria Area World Affairs Council, the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois, our friends from Springfield, and from the Office of Global Studies and Initiatives here on campus, thank you very much